What if I told you that a single sentence, spoken casually at a press conference, lit a fuse that exposed everything wrong with how one organization is handling the most valuable player in women's sports history? Not a scandal, not a trade demand, not a blow-up in the locker room. Just 7 words. An analogy, a comparison that, on the surface, seemed completely harmless. And yet, those 7 words cracked open a debate so deep, so raw, and so impossible to ignore that it is still raging today. Because buried inside that comparison was a question that the Indiana Fever front office may not even realize they're being asked. Do you actually understand what you have? That's what we're getting into today. And I promise you, by the time we're done, you will never look at this franchise the same way again. Let's go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Caitlin Clark's career. You already know that story. We're going back to what Indiana looked like before she arrived. Because if you want to understand why everything that's happened since has felt so electric, so tense, and so genuinely urgent, you first have to understand just how quiet things were. The Indiana Fever weren't a team people talked about at the national level. They weren't filling arenas. They weren't generating headlines outside of hardcore WNBA circles. The 2012 championship banner still hung in the building, but as each year passed, it felt less like a reminder of greatness and more like a relic of a time that was very, very far away. Indiana was rebuilding. Slowly, quietly, without much noise, without much attention, and the broader sports world had mostly moved on. Then, in the span of a few months, something happened that nobody in that front office could have fully planned for. Caitlin Clark arrived, and the Indiana Fever didn't just become relevant again. They became one of the biggest stories in American sports. Think about what that actually means. Not in abstract terms. In concrete, undeniable, impossible to argue with terms. Arenas that had never sold out suddenly had waiting lists. Road games in cities hundreds of miles from Indianapolis became events. Teams moved games to larger venues. Not because of their own stars, because Clark was coming to town. Television networks that had treated WNBA games as programming filler suddenly found themselves reporting ratings numbers they hadn't seen in years. Advertisers took notice. Sponsors came calling. Social media engagement exploded on a daily basis. Merchandise flew off shelves. And perhaps most remarkably of all, people who had never watched a WNBA game in their life suddenly had opinions about Indiana's roster. That is not normal. That has never been normal. What Clark did, what she continues to do, is something that franchise players in every sport dream about doing and almost never actually accomplish. She didn't just raise the level of her team. She raised the floor of an entire league. Her road games made money for opposing franchises. Her presence generated coverage for players who had been waiting years for that kind of spotlight. The rising tide didn't just lift the Fever. It lifted the whole ocean. And this is where the story gets complicated. Because once you fully understand the scale of what Clark brought to Indiana, once you absorb just how fundamentally she changed the economic and cultural reality of that franchise, every single decision the organization makes afterward gets filtered through a different lens. Not the lens of a rebuilding team with time to spare. The lens of an organization sitting on a generational opportunity that they did not create and may not fully appreciate. That's the fire burning underneath all of this. And then came the press conference that poured gasoline on it. Kelly Krauskopf stepped up to the microphone with what appeared to be a completely reasonable intention. She wanted to talk about building something lasting, something sustainable, something that wouldn't crumble the moment one player retired or left. She wanted to explain her vision for the Indiana Fever as a franchise, not just as a team. And in doing so, she reached for an analogy. She said she wanted the Fever to become like Apple. Now, let's be fair to Krauskopf here for just a moment. In a business context, the Apple comparison is actually a compliment. Apple is one of the most successful companies in human history. It has survived leadership transitions, product failures, competitive pressure, and decades of change. It has built a brand that outlasted any individual and created loyalty that extends across generations. If you're a sports executive trying to describe organizational durability, reaching for Apple isn't crazy. On paper, it almost makes sense. But here's the problem, and it's a big one. The moment you compare your franchise to Apple, you are automatically, whether you intended to or not, raising the question of who Steve Jobs is. Because Apple without Steve Jobs was a company that nearly went bankrupt. Apple with Steve Jobs changed the world. And everyone listening to that press conference knew that. So when fans heard the Fever being compared to Apple, they didn't hear a story about organizational stability. They heard a story about whether the front office understood that they had already found their Steve Jobs, and whether they were treating her that way. That distinction ignited something. The reaction across social media was immediate, and it was passionate. Not because fans were looking for a reason to be angry, but because that comparison, intentional or not, seemed to reveal a philosophical gap between how supporters viewed Caitlin Clark and how the organization appeared to view her. Fans didn't see Clark as a valuable component inside a larger brand strategy. They saw her as the reason the brand existed at all right now. They saw her as the thing that made everything else possible. And to hear an executive seemingly place her inside a broader corporate framework, rather than at the absolute center of every decision, that felt wrong to a lot of people. It felt like a misreading of the moment. To understand why the reaction was so intense, you have to appreciate what fans were watching in real time. They weren't speculating about Clark's potential. They were watching her impact unfold, week after week, in ways that left very little room for doubt. Every time Indiana played, something remarkable happened. And not just on the court. The cultural gravitational pull she generated was visible and measurable. People who had spent years ignoring women's basketball were now debating statistics, questioning lineup decisions, and arguing about who deserved to be on her team. That's not something you manufacture. That's not something a marketing department creates. That's something that only happens when a truly rare athlete arrives at exactly the right moment. So when fans heard a comparison that seemed to treat that athlete as a component rather than a catalyst, the frustration wasn't about being dramatic. It was about feeling like the people making the biggest decisions weren't seeing what everyone else was seeing. And then those same people started paying closer attention. Because once you start questioning whether an organization is thinking about things the right way, you start noticing other things too. You start looking at roster construction differently. You start evaluating every free agent signing, every trade, every contract extension through the specific question of whether it helps this team win, while Caitlin Clark is at the peak of her powers. And when you look through that lens, some of what Indiana was doing started generating real questions. Were they surrounding Clark with enough proven veteran talent? Was the roster constructed in a way that maximized her style of play? Were they approaching the offseason with the same urgency that fans felt watching every game? These weren't unfair questions. They were the natural result of expectations that had changed dramatically and rapidly. Expectations that the organization itself had benefited from, even if it hadn't created them. Social media amplified every single one of these conversations. And that's important to understand, because in modern sports, the line between perception and reality can blur faster than any front office is prepared to manage. Once enough people begin questioning an organization's priorities, every action becomes evidence. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every delay becomes a betrayal. The narrative takes on its own momentum, and correcting it requires much more than a well-crafted statement. It requires visible, undeniable action. Meanwhile, a second story was running parallel to all of this, and it was, frankly, even more disconnected from reality than the Apple controversy. While executives were trying to manage the PR fallout from the comparison, outside voices were building a completely different narrative. They were suggesting that the real problem in Indiana wasn't the front office. It was the locker room. Specifically, they were pushing the idea that Clark's enormous popularity was creating resentment among teammates, that the attention imbalance was causing tension, that the environment around her success was fracturing the team from the inside. It spread quickly. It spread because it felt, on the surface, like the kind of thing that could plausibly happen. History has examples of franchises torn apart by inequality of stardom, so people were willing to believe it. But there was a problem with this narrative. A significant one. Almost none of the people closest to the situation supported it. Lexi Hull spoke publicly about the dynamic inside the locker room, and what she described was not a fractured environment. It was a group that understood what they were part of. She pointed not inward, but outward, suggesting that much of the tension existed outside the organization, not within it. The Fever had become a target because of what Clark represented. That's a fundamentally different story than teammates struggling with jealousy. One describes internal dysfunction. The other describes external competition. Those are not the same thing. Sophie Cunningham, who had perspective from spending time in a different franchise environment, offered something equally revealing. She made clear that players around the entire league were aware of what Clark had done for the sport's visibility. That awareness didn't generate hostility. It generated motivation. Teams wanted to beat Indiana. Players wanted to prove themselves against the biggest attraction in the league. What looked like tension from the outside was actually competitive intensity. And there's a very big difference between the two. Clark herself handled the speculation in a way that said more than any statement could have. She didn't get defensive. She didn't fuel the drama. She engaged with it almost with amusement, as if she found it genuinely baffling that people thought they understood situations they had never witnessed. That calm, measured response in the middle of a storm of speculation revealed something about her that no press conference ever could. She wasn't rattled. She was focused, and the team around her, based on everything observable, was focused too. The chemistry that actually existed showed itself in moments that are difficult to fake. Teammates celebrating together after wins. Players genuinely excited for each other's success. Locker room footage that looked natural because it was natural. Over time, those moments accumulated into evidence that stood in direct contradiction to the narrative being built online. And when you add it all up, the picture becomes clear. The locker room wasn't the problem. It was never the problem. The problem, if you could call it that, was always above the locker room. It was always about strategy, urgency, and whether the people in charge were operating on the same timeline as the opportunity they'd been handed. Then the injury concerns arrived, and everything changed again. Before health issues became part of the conversation, the future had felt almost unlimited. Clark was young. She was dominant. The assumption, spoken or unspoken, was that there would be plenty of time, plenty of seasons to get it right, plenty of opportunities to build the perfect roster, make the perfect moves, assemble the perfect team. But sports has a way of punishing that kind of thinking. And the moment injuries entered the picture, even temporarily, the entire frame shifted. Suddenly, people started talking about windows. Championship windows. Competitive windows. The brief, fragile periods during which elite athletes are at their very best and everything is aligned for something extraordinary. Nobody knows how long a window stays open. Some last a decade. Some slam shut in a matter of years. And the thing about windows is that you almost never know they're closing until they're already gone. For many fans, Clark's injury situation served as a reminder of something they had been trying not to think about. She isn't invincible. No athlete is. The time she has at her absolute peak is not guaranteed. And every season that passes without a championship isn't just a missed opportunity. It's an irretrievable one. That realization transformed the conversation. Questions that had felt somewhat abstract now felt urgent. Was the roster deep enough? Were the right veterans in place? Was enough being done to reduce the burden on Clark when she was healthy and operating at full capacity? Was the organization prepared to compete at the highest level, not someday, but right now? The injury didn't create those questions, but it made ignoring them impossible. And then came the expansion draft. Another chapter in a story that kept refusing to end. On paper, expansion is a sign of health. New franchises entering the league means the sport is growing. The process is understood by every team before it begins. Losing players to an expansion draft is simply the cost of participating in a growing enterprise. Rational, logical, completely understandable as a business reality. But rationality has a complicated relationship with passion, and fans weren't evaluating the expansion draft like business analysts. They were evaluating it like people who had watched their team accumulate controversy, absorb injury scares, navigate locker room rumors, and hear their franchise compared to a technology company, all while believing that the window to do something extraordinary was real and present and not going to wait forever. When players departed, the conversation didn't stay focused on the logistics of expansion rosters. It immediately became symbolic. It became another data point in the larger argument about whether the Fever were truly operating with championship urgency. For supporters already watching closely, every departure felt like another crack in a foundation that hadn't yet been fully built. The most revealing part of the backlash wasn't the criticism itself. It was who was doing the criticizing. The loudest voices weren't casual observers hoping to see Indiana fail. They were the most passionate supporters the franchise had. People who had watched the attendance records fall. People who had seen the television ratings climb. People who understood, deeply and personally, that what they were witnessing was rare. Their frustration didn't come from indifference. It came from love. It came from a terrified awareness that history doesn't hand out second chances. And here is where the story arrives at the contradiction that makes it so genuinely fascinating. Because after all of this, the Apple comparison, the injury concerns, the expansion draft losses, the locker room rumors, the front office skepticism, something unexpected was quietly happening in the background. Players around the league weren't running from the fever. They were running toward them. Veterans who had options, who could have gone anywhere, were looking at Indiana and seeing something they wanted to be part of. The organization that fans were criticizing for not moving fast enough was simultaneously becoming one of the most attractive destinations in the sport. That tells you something important. It tells you that despite every controversy, despite every perceived misstep, despite every argument about timelines and urgency and priorities, the foundation that had been built around Caitlin Clark was still magnetic, still powerful, still capable of drawing in the kind of talent that championships are made of. Which brings us to the question that everything in this story has been building toward. The one that the Apple comparison accidentally exposed, that the injury concerns made unavoidable, that the expansion draft brought back to the surface, and that no amount of press conference management has fully answered. Does the Indiana Fever understand what they have? Not in the abstract sense. Not in the quarterly earnings, long-term brand strategy, organizational sustainability sense. Do they understand it in the way that fans understand it? Do they feel the weight of this moment the way supporters feel it? Do they recognize that a player capable of changing the economic reality of a league is not something that gets built around? She's someone the entire operation gets built for? Because that's what this has always been about. Not one quote, not one analogy, not one press conference. It's been about the gap between two different ways of seeing the same thing. One vision is patient, measured, long-term, focused on creating something that lasts beyond any single player. The other vision is urgent, present-focused, terrified of wasting a moment, built on the belief that players like Caitlin Clark are so rare that ordinary timelines simply do not apply. Both visions have logic behind them. Both have historical examples in their favor. But only one of them fully accounts for the reality that the Indiana Fever are currently living. And as the next chapter of this story begins to write itself, as roster decisions get made, as the league continues growing, as Clark continues playing at a level that defies what anyone expected this soon in her career, the answer to that question is going to become very, very clear. The most important decisions haven't happened yet. The window is open, and the entire basketball world is watching to see what Indiana does with it.